Welcome to the Land and Wildlife Speaker Series, our monthly series held on the third Wednesday of the month. My name is Luke Macaulay. For those of you who are new here, I'm the Wildlife Management Specialist for University of Maryland Extension. I work on three main focal areas: bobwhite quail and early successional species. I work a lot on deer attraction, and deer management for especially crop damage. I have a lot of farmers who have a lot of damage from deer, as well as gardeners and others. And then I work a lot on human dimensions of wildlife. So we're running a large landowner survey in the state, and we're finally getting that thing wrapped up. So I'm looking forward to getting those results done soon. So that's what I work on. And I also do a lot of educational work, and this is part of that, and getting information about wildlife management out to you guys in the public. So we are recording. You probably got a notice on your screen when you joined. I would love it. We put this on for free. We were trying to get the word out. I have a YouTube channel. It's not too big. It's not too old yet, but it really helps the algorithms and other people to see our speakers like Sheldon and others to get the word out. We have a lot of work to do to get the word out. So it's really helpful if you can join onto this YouTube channel. If you hit subscribe, it'll help boost this into other people's feeds, your friends and other people. I don't know how the algorithm works, but I know it's good if you hit subscribe and like on the videos. So if you go through and do that afterwards, that's a great help. This QR code, if you're technologically inclined, if you take your phone out on the photo and just take a photo of that little code on the right of the screen, it will take you right to that site, and you can just hit subscribe on your phone right now. I'll mention if you have questions or comments during the chat, there's two buttons on the bottom. You can use either one. I'm usually fine to just manage the chat, so that's fine. You can use the Q&A button if you prefer. It kind of helps keep things a little organized, but I'm flexible and we can handle it both ways. So I'm excited today to talk about, have our speaker, Sheldon Owens. Sheldon Owen. There's no S on the end. Sorry about that, Sheldon.
There's only one of me.
Oh, and I made the mistake on the text at the bottom. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Sheldon is my colleague, my counterpart for West Virginia University Extension, and I also messed that up on the title. Sorry about that. It's WVU, West Virginia University, not University of West Virginia. Is that right, Sheldon?
Correct, yes.
Sorry about that. So he's going to speak. This is a picture of Sheldon. He came out to us and spoke at our Forest Management for Wildlife Symposium we held last July. This is a picture of him on that field trip. He did a great job. His presentation just finally went up on YouTube. We had some audio issues, so you can watch and learn about forest management for wildlife. We were on a field trip and looked at clear cuts. We looked at cerulean warbler cuts, and we looked at an uncut area, and we talked a lot about the benefits of each of these for wildlife. So I will share a link to that in the chat after I'm done here. Coming up, we got next in November, we're going to have Dan Small, frequent collaborator of mine. I'm also oftentimes at his events. He speaks at my events, and but he's been doing a lot of work on bobwhite quail habitat restoration across the state. He's part of the Natural Lands Project with Washington College, and he gives a great talk. If you're into birds, he's got great pictures of birds, and he's really knowledgeable about habitat management for wildlife, especially these early successional and grassland bird species that have a lot of unique kind of nuances to the type of habitat they need. And so he really does a good job breaking down those details in a simple way. So join us on November. We're going to take a break in December for the holiday, and we come back in January 15th, and we're going to talk about another topic. You see fire was in the background of Dan's talk. We're going to talk with the Shannon Wolf of the Maryland Forest Service, talking about planning a prescribed burn. Now, this isn't for everybody, but for those who want to expand their options for land management, this will be an interesting thing. They are rolling out new types of processes to plan prescribed burns and how to get permits and things like that. So join us on January 15th with Shannon Wolf. So here's the little plug again for our social media. I'm on YouTube. I'm also on X. I'm Luke Rangewalker on X. If anybody's on X or Twitter, I post a lot of stuff there. I'm also on LinkedIn. If you follow me there, I post a lot of the stuff straight over from X onto LinkedIn. So give us a follow on these platforms. Last commercial I will make is I have an online course and community. Would love to have you guys join on and check it out. Let me know what you think. We have a few different videos breaking down some of the topics. Would love to hear. And it's also, it has a nice chat function, so you can ask questions of others. We're trying to build a critical mass of people who are excited about land management for wildlife on there. So that's the URL and the link. I'll put this all in the chat afterwards. Okay, I lied. There's another plug. If you want to get on my email list, you probably are already on it. If you're not, you can sign up at wildlife.umd.edu and you'll get a free guide. You'll get this copy of the habitat management for quail guide here on the right. So if you don't have that already, you'll get it right there. And finally, when you leave, we do surveys to see to get suggestions from you and to have ideas what you liked, what you'd like more of, what you maybe like a little less of, and ideas for speakers you'd like in the future. So when you leave Zoom, you will jump in and get this survey. So with that, thank you so much. I've gone on long enough, and I want to introduce Sheldon. Sheldon got his undergraduate degree at Mississippi State in forestry and wildlife management. He then moved on to University of Georgia, where he got a master's degree, where he looked at forest-dwelling bat species. And then he went on. That wasn't enough education for him. He's like me. He wanted to keep learning. I would finish my master's. I was like, I'm really enjoying this. I'm really enjoying what I'm learning. He went on to West Virginia University, WVU, for his PhD, where he worked on raccoon disease ecology, including roundworms and rabies. Did I get all that right, Sheldon?
Close enough for government work.
I might have messed a few of those things up, but he has a broad diversity of experiences. I learn a lot from Sheldon whenever he's talking, so I'm excited to hear from him today, and I hope you guys get a lot out of it.
Awesome. Good, Dr. Macaulay. Thank you very much, Luke. Thanks for the introduction there. Yep. Many will put the S on the last name of Owens. I always have to remind them it's only one of me, right? So it's not plural, but yeah, no worries there. And thank you for this opportunity today. And it was great to work with you back in July at Woodland Management Workshop. And I think this is where you had me cornered and asked me to come on and speak here in October. And you were asked for a topic back then. And just at the end of that meeting and talking with the landowners and the managers that were there, you get these different perspectives and what they kind of see and expect to happen at the end of any type of management activity in the field. And it was heavy on my mind at that point, just thinking about different expectations when we put in some of these wildlife management practices. And so I gave you that title, not really knowing what I would say at the end of it. So we're trying to meet that title description today. So I appreciate you all joining. Thanks for the opportunity. I am Sheldon Owen, originally from Mississippi, and so some people will mention that they notice a bit of a Southern accent when I talk. So obviously that's what the chat is for. If I say something you just don't quite understand, pop something in the chat, then we'll see if we can't straighten it out. It's always, speaking here in West Virginia, talking with landowners, and what's the difference between an acorn and an acorn, right? It's the same thing. It's just how I say it coming from the Southeast. But today we're kind of talking about management expectations when we're conducting wildlife management activities. And this is going to be a fun talk today. We're going to talk about a lot of, successes, a lot of failures, and what we can learn from that, and how we can kind of change our mindset when we're starting to implement some of these wildlife management practices. Obviously here with my title screen, we would all love to see, the biggest, fattest common snapping turtle that we can. Hopefully we're managing habitat in a way that makes that the healthiest species that we have there. But in many cases, our expectations, if I want to see brown bear here in West Virginia or in Maryland, that's probably not going to happen. So I need to manage what we're actually managing for, and rethink some of the practices that we put in place, and kind of setting some of our objectives. And so we'll have fun today talking about various topics, and a lot of photos, and just a lot of discussion today. So please feel free to answer or pop questions in the chat there. And I'll let you kind of watch over that. And if there are any things that pop up that we need to address at that moment, please interrupt, and we'll go from there, because we'll be informal today.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Good deal. All right. So first of all, we're all on the same page and thinking about wildlife management. I always have to go back to Mississippi State, and it was the late Dr. Bruce Leopold, who was one of our early wildlife management professors there, and we had this working definition of wildlife management. And depending on which text you read or which biologists you talk to will all have some kind of different variation on it. But wildlife management is the art and science of manipulating animal populations and their habitat to reach a desired goal. right? We talk about the art and science. There's a lot of research going on. The good Dr. Macaulay is involved in research, trying to learn more and develop more techniques. And we're building on this science background and the science base to better manage our animals and our populations, and then the habitat in which they rely. But in a lot of cases, there's some art to it in terms of how do we distribute this across the landscape? How do we balance needs of wildlife? Much like some of the calls that Dr. Macaulay gets, the first one in the morning is Sheldon, I want to get more deer on my property. How can I manage my property to get more deer? And then I hang up with that landowner and speak to their neighbor who calls right after it and says, how do I get rid of all these deer on my neighbor's property? Obviously, our objectives don't always match up. And so there is an art form to it. And that's the fun part of wildlife management, I think. And working with animal populations, probably our best example, or working with game species. And we can manage our deer populations through harvest. Seasons have kicked off here in West Virginia, so hopefully you all are out hunting and harvesting some of the deer that are out there on the landscape and enjoying our natural resources. So we can manipulate bag limits and season lengths to actually manage some of our wildlife species in that way. You look at some of our others like American beaver that was once almost wiped out of the eastern United States, and how we've reintroduced those and kind of rebuilt some of those populations. And so those are other examples of how we work with the populations themselves. But most of what I do and we do, Luke and I do, is managing habitat, to indirectly impact those wildlife species. And so to work with those populations. So a lot of what we do, and this is the fun part of manipulating habitat out there, the vegetations on the landscape, to reach some desired goal. When I first started as a youngster, as a young fledgling biologist, what got me into wildlife management was, if you can remember the old show Mutual of Omaha, Wild Kingdom, where they would go out and wrestle anacondas and tackle gazelles on the African plains. And that's what I wanted to do, right? I wanted to work with wildlife. I want to put my hands on wildlife. But 95% of what we do today is working with people, helping them kind of meet their landowner objectives and implement some of these wildlife management practices. So it's a little bit of a shift in what we do. And so I had to change my expectations of what I was going to be doing as a wildlife biologist, because again, I was going to be chasing those animals. That's all I was going to work with. And so there's a little bit of a shift in this. And so we start thinking about implementing these practices, or we're going to design a wildlife management plan. We need to think about the outcomes in this. And it's not always, if I apply X, I'm going to get Y. There's always something that's going to play with. These are wild systems, and control in these is very difficult because Mother Nature is not easy to control. And we'll talk about some of the issues with that as we go forward. These wild animals don't always cooperate, and the vegetation doesn't always respond in the way that we think it will. And so we need to think about our expectations at the end of this as we finish up or continue with our wildlife management practices or implement these practices on the landscape. So as landowners, I encourage you to develop a plan. If you're thinking about wildlife management, develop a plan. And it can be as simple as writing things down on a napkin, a note card, or some specialized, very detailed plan of how you're going to start and then implement practices and actually end up with evaluating the results of your practices. And so any wildlife management plan, I think, should include these 5 components. One, identify your management goals and objectives, what you're trying to do. Second, where are you starting from? What resources do you currently have? And, assess the habitat you have and determine what changes need to be made, if any, need to be made. And so identifying those unique resources that you have on your property, very important. What habitat management or wildlife management practices need to be implemented to change habitat or impact habitat for the wildlife species that's your objective. And then when are we going to implement these? What's the best time of year? If you're talking about prescribed fire, like Luke mentioned, this workshop coming up, prescribed fire in the spring of the year versus the growing season in the summer versus the dormant season in the fall and winter, they all have different impacts and they all have different results at the end of it. And so understanding those are very important of when these should be implemented. And finally, that evaluation of management. Did all of these steps that we just took, all the practices we put into place, did it work? And so this is where, in coming down to it, if we're managing our expectations, evaluation is very important. At the end of all of this, did we reach our goal? Did we successfully reach our goal? And so if we're managing those outcomes and we're thinking about how the end game is going to end up, to try to help us make sure that we're meeting those goals, we would encourage you to set clear objectives. And so this is what I want to manage for. So if you know starting out, this is what I want to manage for, hopefully, all the practices you put in place at the end, when you start to evaluate the end process, you've reached that management goal and objective. And we can look at it in two different ways. One, take a focal species approach. And working with a lot of landowners around West Virginia, this is where I want landowners to to key in. If you pick a particular species, you get to do a little homework and understand the habitat requirements of that species. And then any practice you put into place is going to benefit that one species. And so when it comes down to evaluating the success of that management plan, that the steps that you've taken are going to benefit that one wildlife species. And so you should have a successful management plan at the end of this. Now, obviously, the one species that you've picked there, and I've thrown up a picture because we're getting close to Halloween. We've got to throw a bat species up there. We've got the Virginia big-eared bat there. Understanding its wildlife habitat or its habitat requirements, understanding its natural history, its ecology, and the conservation practices that we need to put into place are very important. And so, focusing on what it needs and then implementing the practices to change landscape or habitat vegetation around it to meet those needs, again, very important. And so, one, our Virginia big-eared bat is going to benefit from the practices we put into place, and then other species will benefit from that as well. A whole suite of species will benefit depending on which practices or which habitat is manipulated at that time. And so, but obviously the one we want to key in on is going to benefit from it. A second approach, we can have that focal species approach, or just a second approach if you don't really know the species you really want to manage for, but you have this particular old field or forest or some type of vegetation in your backyard, and that's what you want to manage for, and you want to make it the best that it can possibly be, then not a focal species approach, but just a healthy habitat approach or a healthy ecosystem approach. And so you're trying to make that vegetation that is out there, the habitat that is in your backyard, making it the best that it can possibly be. So kind of two different approaches. And then when we think about expectations, obviously any practice that we put into place for the Virginia big-eared bats going to benefit it. When it comes to healthy habitat, again, we're focusing on that habitat, and a whole group of other species are going to benefit from it. But it may not be that focal species. This old field, this early successional vegetation that you see in the photos, probably not going to benefit that Virginia big-eared bat as much as forest management would. So again, just trying to key in on what your focal objective is going to be, but setting a clear objective. This is what I want to do is going to help you in taking those steps going forward and reaching that objective. And so your expectation is, I want to manage for this. You're going to have successful, and you're going to meet that expectation at the end of the day. So again, looking at that focal species, let that focal species guide you. It's lunch here on a Wednesday. You may be, sitting there eating a sandwich in between, this little break in between work. Now I'm going to give you some homework, right? You're going to go out, if you're taking this focal species approach, you need to learn about that species and learn the habitat requirements of it. We'll pick on the monarch butterfly here, fascinating, iconic species here in the eastern United States. Our only migratory butterfly that takes multiple generations to complete its migration pathway. Our monarchs that are leaving West Virginia now are heading down to central Mexico, to the high fir forest down there to overwinter. They'll start the spring migration back, making it up into South Texas and the southeastern or southwestern United States. They'll lay eggs and then they'll die. And so it's that next generation. It's not this migratory individual that's made it all the way back down there, but the great-great-grandchildren that we'll see again this time next year. So it's a phenomenal species, and their populations are declining significantly. The past 20 years, we've lost about 90% of their population because of habitat changes, because of land use changes, because of increased use in insecticides. And so there's a lot of threats that have impacted our monarch butterfly. But if I'm picking that as my focal species, I'm focusing in on those milkweed species, the Asclepias species that are out there, common milkweed, butterfly weed, the orange at the bottom, and then also some swamp milkweed. Those are 3 common milkweeds that can be found here in West Virginia. We've got about 9 different species of milkweeds that can be found here in West Virginia, but those are our most common ones. And if I want to see butterfly on the landscape, I need to make sure that those plant species are out there. So understanding the focal species, understanding their habitat requirements, will guide me in terms of what I need to do to help manage that species. Now, again, if we're taking at just a healthy habitat approach, let the habitat guide you. Take you back to 8th grade biology. What 3 things do all animals need to survive? Food, cover, and water. Shelter and cover, we kind of use those interchangeably. Some of our wildlife species, much like our American kestrel here, will use shelter, a cavity, to raise young, whereas white-tailed deer just may be looking for thick cover, escape cover to escape predation or to reduce stress. And so food, cover, and water, and that 4th component, space, the amount of area, the arrangement of these resources across the landscape are very important. So homework, 1, if you're taking that focal species approach, go learn about that focal species. But 2, if you're looking at that healthy habitat approach, or just looking at the vegetation, thinking about a healthy ecosystem, if you want healthy habitat, what food resources are you providing? What shelter or cover resources are you providing? What water resources are available? And how are they arranged on the landscape? Many times we'll look at our backyard and it may be 1/3 of an acre, it may be 20 acres, it may be 1,000 acres. That size of that area does have an impact in terms of what we need to manage for. Because if I'm just on 1/10 of an acre, I need to look at the limiting resource, and I may have food and cover, but I don't have water. Well, my neighbor, who is maybe 20 yards away, does have water. And so is that a limiting resource? Depending on the species, in most cases not. They can still cross those geographic boundaries, those political boundaries, and get to that resource. And so, just utilizing what's in your backyard, what resources do you have there for wildlife, promoting those resources to make sure you have plenty of maybe acorns, maybe oak trees that are back there, flowering plants that are back there, ephemeral pools or vernal ponds that may be on your property, making sure those are the best that they can possibly be. So 1, take that focal species approach, or 2, take that healthy habitat approach. And when we talk about vegetation on the landscape, many of the landowners that I work with will say, well, I'm really a hands-off, I'm a no management type of philosophy. I want to let Mother Nature take its course. That's perfectly viable. That's great. That's your choice in doing that. But again, in managing expectations, over time, that vegetation is going to change, and the associated wildlife species are going to change. We always throw up this vegetative succession kind of diagram, looking at how after some disturbance, let's say we take a bulldozer into your backyard and take it down to bare soil, just to the soil that was there. Over time, there'll be this fairly predictable replacement of plant communities. We'll go from these annual grasses and forbs being anything other than a grass or a sedge or a rush. These annual grasses and forbs that will move into more perennial grasses and forbs. Woody species will start to encroach because of our climates here in the mid-Atlantic region. Woody species will start to encroach, and eventually Mother Nature is trying to take that to a forest. And so over time, the vegetative communities that are out there will change, and so will the associated wildlife species. And so, yes, if you're taking that healthy habitat approach, obviously that habitat, the vegetation that is out there, is going to change, and then also the associated wildlife species. And so, again, taking those different approaches, whether it be a focal species or just healthy habitats, can mean differences in terms of the actions that you take. If I'm a focal species here and I know that I'm a grassland obligate, I know a species that needs early successional vegetation. I think I threw a bobolink photo in here a little bit later. I know that I need to manage for those early successional vegetation. So if I want a bobolink on the landscape, I'm going to maintain my vegetation in my backyard as that early successional grassland type of habitat. Or if I need to, or if my focal species is a scarlet tanager, maybe I need to maintain or grow a forest on my property. So just, again, understanding that our wildlife species require or utilize different vegetation types, or these different successional stages of vegetation out there on the landscape. And it's important to understand that and know that. And so if we're expecting to manage for a bobolink and we have a forest, then we need to make some changes. And it's going to be a little more involved than just allowing Mother Nature to take its course. Specifically, if we're talking wildlife management here in West Virginia and in some parts of Maryland there, our forests are getting older. We've got larger diameter trees, closed canopies, and these closed canopies, they're doing their job by collecting sunlight and sending resources down to the tree themselves, but they are doing that at the detriment to other species down in the understory. Those that may need a little bit more sunlight. So the closed canopy is really impacting what's growing there in the understory. And then we also have some hooved ungulates there, the ubiquitous white-tailed deer, that's having an impact on our understories as well. And so the little vegetation that's trying to grow is being browsed or over-browsed in many cases by white-tailed deer. And so again, if we're thinking, letting Mother Nature take its course, we've got this closed canopy forest, we think, hey, maybe that's the healthiest habitat out there. And again, if your objective is no management, that's fine. But if we're thinking, okay, healthy forests may be a more disturbed forest. And so we may need to consider some type of disturbance, mechanical, whether it be removing one tree, felling one tree, killing one tree, or a group of trees, or even some large scale tree removal in terms of forest management or forest regeneration management out there on the landscape. Because as we look up, all those leaves working extremely hard to gather that sunlight, but it's blocking out anything. We go back to that photo, blocking back anything that could possibly grow on the forest floor. And, if we're providing, we'll pick on white-tailed deer today. If we're trying to provide browse for white-tailed deer, very little browse there in that understory. If we're thinking about cover for brown thrashers or for dark-eyed juncos that are there in the forest floor, do we have any vegetation there for them to hide in, for them to browse in, for them to actually build nests in? And so it can negatively impact some of these other species. And so a healthy habitat or healthy forest may need some disturbance to benefit more species. And so don't overlook that or think, hey, we don't need to consider it, depending on your objectives, obviously, but because it can be very beneficial. And just opening up that forest canopy, 20, 30, 40% in some cases can really increase the amount of sunlight that hits the forest floor and change the structure within that forest, and also change the habitat for many species, providing new areas for foraging, providing areas to build nests, provide areas to escape predation or protective cover as well. So definitely, opening up that forest canopy is very important. And it's easy for me to say, and this goes back to sort of our managing expectations. Look, let's go out there, let's remove one tree, let's remove 2 or 3 trees, let's open up that forest canopy 20, 30%. What goes on in that understory? And so there are things that we need to consider. It's easy to say that, but then in reality, looking at the understory, what's growing there? Consider what's growing in the understory in terms of exotic invasive species. If it is already, dominated, your understory is dominated by these non-native species, and then you open up that forest canopy, hey, guess what? Guess what you're going to get back, or what's going to dominate that understory? And that's, in terms of a healthy habitat, probably not the best out there in terms of creating that healthy habitat. These are going to outcompete our natives. It's not going to provide the same food resources that our native plant species will. And so, your expectation is we're going to have a healthy habitat, but in reality, we've just created, something that's, dominated by non-natives and not beneficial to the wildlife that we're trying to encourage out there. So we always have to address, or always at least look at, what's going on in the understory, and making sure we're addressing the species that are there. And in some cases, the amount of browse pressure that is there. So our white-tailed deer have significant impacts. They're considered as a keystone species. They can negatively impact the habitat or the environment for themselves and other species as well. And so, again, your expectation is, if I'm just going to put in this practice, there may be some other steps you need to consider. Again, identifying what species are there in the understory and addressing that deer population that is out there. So,
Sheldon, real quick, sorry to interrupt. Could you describe each of these invasives that you got, and just let us know what they are, so for people who might not know.
Yeah. So we're upper left-hand corner, we've got the tree of heaven, which is a common, woody species. It's really dominating our forest now, especially along the interstates, where these little winged seeds are very interesting. The fact they catch in the wind and they can fly up, and travel great distances. So tree of heaven, upper left-hand corner, we've got the Japanese stiltgrass there in the bottom center. That's really dominating our forest floors. And then when we look in our forest, we see all this green out there. And we think, oh, that's a healthy habitat because we have green species. Well, if it's a green Japanese stiltgrass, it's there because nothing else is eating it. And so that's not necessarily the best case scenario. So Tree of Heaven, Japanese stilt grass. Then we've got autumn olive or Russian olive up in the upper right-hand corner, which was, it provides great structure. It's a great shrub tree, great fruit source, obviously a food source, but non-native. Is there something better that is out there? You start looking at some of the research, the science, and as backyards, as habitats start to increase in the percent coverage of these non-native invasives, we've got a lot of decline in bird recruitment, and so survival, fledgling success, a lot of decline in just health in the habitat itself. And so, yeah, they can negatively impact. And I've got a colleague, the good Dr. Dave McGill here, is our forest resource specialist. I'm the wildlife resource specialist. He's forest, and we travel around doing a lot of woods and wildlife talks. And we often discuss, we have fun. We're in the road, in the vehicle traveling all over the state. So we've got a lot of windshield time as we're traveling. And we'll often debate and talk about the impacts of these non-native invasive plants, because our forests are changing. Look, 20, 30 years ago, they looked completely different than they did today, not only because of management, but because of the species that are found out there. And so as we're promoting, native species, that means we're also trying to fight these non-native species that are out there. And so in some cases, if you're managing for them and your neighbor is not, obviously it's a lifelong battle. And so obviously this autumn olive provides some benefit, not the best benefit to wildlife, because there's, our natives would be better, but it does provide some benefit in terms of cover and in terms of browse or food that is there as well. And so there are some benefits. Japanese stilt grass, I haven't found a benefit yet. Tree of Heaven, I hadn't found that benefit yet. But definitely there are some benefits out there. But consider what's in the understory and the impact of these non-native invasive species. So yeah, this is just 3 of many that are found out there in our forest. And if you don't think, hey, I don't have any exotic invasives in my backyard, look again, because we're all dealing with them, and we're all having to fight them out there. And again, it's a battle worth fighting, I think, but it's definitely a lifelong battle as we're going through this.
A couple of quick things, Sheldon, that are coming through on the chat, and because we get a lot of interest in invasive species and how to manage them. 2 things. One is, and for those of you who are new, if you're wondering how to identify these in your backyard and you're not a botanist and don't have a key ID book, I have found a couple of apps that are great. I use a free one called Seek. iNaturalist is also good. I've also, because I work in the field, I pay an annual fee for Picture This, which will sometimes force an identification when Seek or iNaturalist can't do it. So those are the tools I use and they're pretty good, especially at these invasives, because they're so common. So they key in pretty well. The second question is, Sheldon, is have you had any success controlling stilt grass? That one has come in and is something that I'm continuing to work on and had little success with. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's, luckily it's stilt grass is easy to kill. It's just hard to get rid of because the seed bank is full of it. And so again, I can treat it, even 2% glyphosate solution can get rid of it for this year, but the seed bank is full of it and it'll just come back next year. So it's going to be multiple years of treatment. It's going to take time. Again, it's that lifelong battle. And so, yeah, successful in killing it, but ridding the forest floor of it is another story, because it's everywhere. And any type of disturbance that occurs out there, it can really take hold. And so there's some success stories, but it's we're still battling it, if you will.
I'm personally going to try a pre-emergent herbicide, which it seems like that's one of the more effective means. I've tried mechanical methods to stop it from going to seeds. It's an annual, but I find it's just as prevalent as it's after multiple years. I'm still finding it very prevalent. So I'm thinking about trying that. Have you tried pre-emergence yourself, or?
I have it in these locations just because we don't have the sites where we can plan ahead. It's kind of taking care of it right now. But yeah, I mean, we'll try to get you some resources. I've got a good colleague, Dr. Rakesh Chandran, who's our weed specialist, who's done research on not only stilt grass but jointhead grass, 2 of our invasives here in West Virginia. And he's looked at the timing. He's looked at some of these pre-emergent herbicides, treatment, and some mechanical treatments. So I'll get that information to Luke, and we'll get that out to the group as a share me, crossing that that political boundary, West Virginia and Maryland working together. I don't know if that's good or bad, but we'll definitely get some information out there to you.
Thank you. Sorry for the interruption, Sheldon.
No problem.
Yeah.
So we've set clear objectives already to help manage our expectations, and now let's set some reasonable objectives. And this, this commonly comes up when I'm working with landowners, and they say, I've got 7 acres here, and I want to harvest a 170, 180 inch class buck every year. I'm like, well, one may walk across that property and you may get that, but it's not going to be an annual event. You're not going to have multiple, size individuals of that size walking across. And so again, just understand that within reason. Don't think that, again, have that brown bear. We're not going to bring brown bear into the eastern United States. We're not going to have these massive 200-inch class bucks walking across our property every day of every season. And so set those reasonable objectives, and those things that can be measured and quantified. Look, 2 different deer here in West Virginia. I would be happy with the one on the left. I'll be happy with the one on the right. What is my expectation at the end of the day? Many will argue, we can't have large deer here in West Virginia because of maybe we have average parcel size in West Virginia is about 35 acres. Our average farm size is a little over 100 acres. It's hard to manage because our deer are moving, let's say average home range size is about 600, 640 acres. Our properties are just a piece of the puzzle. And if I'm managing here, our neighbor may not be. And so can I provide enough food cover and water here on my property? Once it crosses the boundary, will it be harvested? This landowner here on the right is a great partner down in the southern part of the state. He has about 1,000 acres that he manages. And he is a strict, we want older age class deer. There's a lot of forest management to get some browse down on the ground. There's a lot of early successional management to get some nice summertime forage out there as well. And so he's taking the steps to produce large whitetails. And he's definitely, these are old deer that he's harvesting, 4.5, 5.5-year-old deer. So he's getting some great deer out there. But it's also funny in terms of, when he started this whole process of quality deer management or larger, older deer management, his neighbors would come to him and ask, how's that management strategy of managing older deer, promoting older deer? How's it working out for you? Because it's working out great for us. We're hunting right beside you and we're getting all these big deer that are coming off your property. And he's a great guy. He's like, man, I wish you hadn't, but it's part of it. Understanding and expecting that our neighbors are going to harvest, big deer that we see on our property. It's part of it. As soon as they cross the property boundary, we have no control of where those animals are going. So that's part of it. Setting those reasonable objectives. You're not going to keep, this 160-inch deer on your 7 acres all year, all the time, and so it's going to move. And so understand that, and that's part of it. And maybe. Again, managing those expectations. Maybe a doe is just as good. I don't care how long you boil those antlers, you can't eat them. And so just kind of managing those expectations and think about what's going on out there. In terms of the size of the antlers that are out there, or even the number of deer that are out there. A lot of landowners, if they want to see 30, 50 deer every evening that they hunt, and that's good that you can see that, and it's wonderful that you get that enjoyment out of it. But man, that has an impact on the environment. And we always say you can't stockpile deer. If we're piling as many deer out there, trying to promote as many deer out there, that's having an impact on the environment. That's having an impact on the vegetation that is out there. Some of the studies that are out there saying if your deer density is 8 deer per square mile, you're starting to lose some of your native plant diversity that's going on. If you're at the 16 deer per square mile, you're going to lose some forest regeneration. And if you talk to those land managers, one of the biggest deals are, overabundant deer herds that are impacting that vegetation on the ground, not on the native species, but, that forest regeneration. And so having too many deer can be a detriment. And it can result in some issues. And this is a location that we're working with up in the northern panhandle that have extremely high deer numbers. And if you can see all of this vegetation in the back, we talked about those non-native invasive. This brown vegetation here is stilt grass. The kind of the greenish shrub is Chinese privet. And they do have pawpaw in the understory because deer don't eat pawpaw. That's one of our native plants that are out there, but little else is native plant species because the number of deer are browsing on it. Take you to the eastern panhandle of West Virginia, we have this new species of eastern red cedar that grows kind of like a reverse ice cream cone, right? Because of deer browse. That's the only green vegetation that is out there in late winter months. And you can see the impacts of the browse. eastern red cedar is not a preferred food source for white-tailed deer, but if that's the only green thing they have, then it is what it is. Also, we have many landowners around the state of West Virginia that are planting food plots. They're a little late to be planting them now, but they've planted food plots in the fall, and then they'll give me a call and say, well, nothing grew. So, the seed was bad, the soil was bad, what went on out there? And this can be one of those two, but many times it's just that there are too many deer for what you're trying to grow. You've not got enough browse down on the ground for them. The food plot's not large enough, or you have too many deer. And so once we put up an exclusion cage like this to see, in the absence of deer browse, how does the plants grow? And you can see inside, yeah, we've got green vegetation coming up. Outside, the browse is just too heavy. So one, either we need to expand the amount of area that we're planting in food plots, or two, reduce the number of deer. This is some of our pollinator research that we have going on here in West Virginia, even in areas where we have relatively low deer densities and we have a lot of deer browse, available deer browse that is out there, our white-tailed deer are selective browsers. And so they're going to key in on what they want to eat, right? They're going to find the exact leaf on the plant they think is the most nutritious, or the most palatable, they're going to shift in their plant species that they're feeding on, throughout the year. And so here is a single, we've got a lot of weed encroachment now outside of it, but this is a single planting of black-eyed Susan, Rudbeckia species. So inside this cage, we have, 1.5 feet, 2 foot flowering plants, and outside of it, it's just the basal florets, basically. So as soon as it gets up above the ground, the deer feeding on it. So you can see the impact of white-tailed deer on the growth of our native plant species that are out there. Even in relatively low deer densities and abundant browse that is around, you can see the impact on these selected species that our deer are feeding on. So it's pretty eye-opening and pretty, again, managing expectations. I planted this out there. I expect it to grow and expect it to flower, but deer may be having that negative impact on it. With our pollinator plants as well, we need to be patient with these things that are growing. And this is kind of what we're looking at with a browse versus unbrowsed plot. Will these basal florets, will they come back next year? And so many of our native plants take multiple years to grow and to actually flower. We'll often say that, the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and then the third year they leap. And so we need to be patient when we're watching these plants grow out there on the landscape as well. Again, we need to address the deer population. And so, obviously outside, look at this green vegetation of Japanese barberry, exotic invasive species. This is a lot more of that Japanese stiltgrass, right on the edge of this nice clover plot that we're trying to get established. So, again, managing expectations, let's look at the whole picture. How does your backyard fit into this, or how does your property fit into this? And it may, again, I'm looking at my small 1/10 of an acre, 1/3 of an acre. I'm looking at my 100-acre pasture, but we, in many cases, we need to look at this large multi-continent, distribution of how these birds are going to be moving. This is our bobolink, found here in our high elevation, early successional vegetation, or high elevation grasslands here in West Virginia. Long distance migrant, and so they're spending a lot of time flying in between these continents to complete their life cycle. And so we're only one small piece in a few months out of the summer that we're providing habitat for this species. And so again, considering that in our management objectives. So in my backyard, I've got this one, potted plant here. We've got some exotics in there, more ornamentals than native plant species. But can this benefit wildlife? And if we look a little bit closer, we've got 4 monarch butterflies that are feeding on this one plant. And so every little bit helps. Don't think that I've only got 1/10 of an acre, I can't really benefit wildlife. You can make a difference with just little additions. You may not be providing all components of habitat, but we have this nectaring resource for butterflies here that you are providing. And so that's one component of habitat that you can do in your backyard, regardless of the size of your property. I've got here in my front yard, I've got a little, let's say it's a 10 by 10. It may be 100 square feet, little pollinator plot that it started with one common milkweed. I said, hey, I'll just protect that and I'll let it grow. And then, common milkweeds produce through their root systems. And so it started out as one stem, and then it was 2 stems, and then 6 stems. And now I've got about 30, 35 stems in this one little 100-foot or square foot area. And last year, in this one 30-plus stem, 100-square-foot area, we pulled off about 33 caterpillars. And then I had young daughters at home, so we brought them inside just to see them go through that metamorphosis. We fed them on the milkweeds, and then we went into chrysalis. We brought them inside, and then we released that 30-plus species, 30-plus individuals of these monarch butterflies just in that 100-square-foot area. So again, it doesn't take much, and it's estimated that it takes about 30 stems of milkweed to get one butterfly back to Mexico. So hey, maybe I've got 1.1 or 1.2 butterflies back based on my 30-plus stems in just one small area in my front yard. Because of that, we kind of need to rethink what the definition of messy. Rethink what is messy out there. I'll often argue, the addition of a cup holder to our lawnmowers have done more damage to wildlife habitat than anything else. This recreational mowing. We like things to be clean, neat, and we're not allowing our vegetation to grow. We're not allowing it to flower. We're not allowing it to go to seed, and that's removing that food from the landscape. And so try to avoid recreational mowing. I'm giving you an excuse not to mow, and let that vegetation kind of grow and mature and provide forage, provide cover, provide a food source. As we're attracting insects, we're also feeding birds, these larger vertebrates that are out there. And so, kind of rethink the idea of what is messy and allow things to kind of grow up a little bit. The wilder it looks, in many cases, the better it is for wildlife. More structure, more species diversity, more benefit to wildlife. And, saying that, I can also see, managing expectations is also educating individuals of what's going on out there. This one plot is our Natural Resources Center at our research forest at West Virginia University, our WVU research forest there. And a month prior to this photo, this was all green vegetation. And so one of the administrators came by, looked at that and said, man, that is messy. We need to clean that up. Why is no one taking care of this flower bed at the NRC? They come back a month later, everything is flowering. The same administrator says, finally, someone took care of that mess that was growing in here. Again, at what time were you looking at it? And what is your expectation? That green, wild-looking vegetation will eventually turn into something beautiful in many cases, providing a food source for our wildlife. So again, managing that expectation, letting people know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Here's one research plot that we have down at our Jackson's Mill in Lewis County, West Virginia. It was a pond bank dominated by cool season grasses. So a lot of fescue, a lot of orchard grass there. We came in late April using a broad spectrum herbicide, glyphosate, to kind of kill all that cool season grass, the carpet that was there that was prohibiting other plants from actually growing. You can see, May 10th, we're seeing some brown vegetation is starting to die off. May 25th, that cool season grass is gone, and now we've got these warm season common milkweeds coming in. This location, we didn't plant. All we did was remove that cool season carpet, and a third of it came back in common milkweed, a third of it came back in butterfly weed, and 1/3 came back in wingstem. All beneficial, all native plant species for our pollinators here in West Virginia. And so all we did was allow that vegetation to grow and not mow it. Now, it doesn't always work out that way. It depends on what the seed bank is. It depends on what is growing there before. So there's a lot of characteristics. And so managing my expectation, hey, it worked once, it definitely work again, it's not always the case. It's a lot of history that goes on with these sites. And once we disturb it, it's always good to get out there and follow that vegetation along. Understand, again, doing a little bit of homework and taking those apps that Luke was talking about and learning the plant species that are coming back. Are they the ones that you want to grow back? Also managing expectations and kind of managing neighbors. Some of the maintenance workers there on site said, Sheldon, I saw the weeds you were growing out there, and so I went ahead and mowed them for you. Because, in their mind, their expectation was that's weedy, we need to keep it clean. My expectation, hey, this is good flowering habitat for many of our pollinators that are out there. And so, they helped, not necessarily good for my objective, but good for theirs. So again, it depends on those objectives and how do we manage those. But you can see that it responded. That's fine. It actually benefited because, if a milkweed is growing, starts growing in May and matures, it's already flowered and seeded and started to senesce when many of our monarch butterflies are arriving. And so we need to actually cut back or set back some of that so we can have some fresh growing vegetation somewhere in the middle of the year. But education may be important in terms of letting people know what you're doing and why you're doing it, to come up with a good idea of, again, education and getting everyone on the same page to ensure that we maximize our benefits and actually reach our objectives. Now, we can talk about our expectations, but in some cases, some things you can't control, right? In wildlife management, there's a lot of things that we can't control. These are wild animals. These are wild plants. And this is Mother Nature that we're dealing with. If you look at, this past summer, we've gone through one of the worst droughts that we've had here in West Virginia in over 30 years. And so we're still trying to recover and get out of that. And that has impacted our vegetation. That's impacted our wildlife because of lack of vegetation in many cases. If you were trying to grow something or plant something, here's one of our plantings of early successional vegetation. This is one of our pollinator plants, but you can see the cracking of the soil. It kind of looking at it's like, man, that looks kind of bleak because of the drought. And so, best laid plans, hey, we planned this out accordingly. We waited until we were going to get some rain. We did everything right. But Mother Nature said, nope, we're not going to give you any more rain for 2 months. And so it can negatively impact what we were trying to grow out there. And so, again, there's all these obstacles that you can see. And so in terms of managing expectations, realize that, we're hoping for the best, but expect the worst in some cases because bad things can happen out there. And these are all learning experiences, and we can go back and change now. We can say, okay, we need to restart next year. And so we've learned from it. And some things we can't control for. Obviously, we can't control for a drought, but maybe we'll rethink the plant species that we plant out there that are a little more drought hardy in case, if we're thinking about more resilient, climate resilient plantings, maybe we need to address what plant species we're trying to grow out there. Also, Mother Nature throws us some curveballs from time to time. We're experiencing an EHD, epizootic hemorrhagic disease outbreak now. We've got in about 18 counties here in West Virginia. Some significant mortality. One local park that I'm working with, we pulled off 76 dead deer now just over the past 2 weeks. And so some significant mortality in those localized areas. EHD is non-zoonotic, so we're not worried about the human health aspect, but it can have locally some significant impact to the deer population. So I've done everything right. I've managed habitat. I'm preparing for hunting season, or I've got these large deer that I'm watching in my backyard, and Mother Nature throws us another curveball, and we have a disease outbreak that could potentially, impact that. So again, kind of those things that we can't control. And finally, when we look at it, even our best laid plans, you see that swamp milkweed there in the background and all of these monarch butterfly wings. We were managing this food, this area, this early successional area. We had great species diversity, abundant plant life that's growing out there. And then we had this kind of garden spider that's built a web right over this swamp milkweed that's picking off our monarchs when they come in to nectar or they come in to lay eggs. And so even our best laid plans, hey, there are things that we miss out on, and we kind of created a sink there on this one plant. Obviously, over the large scale, we've got multiple plants. These garden spiders can't eat them all. And so we're going to benefit and increase the number of insects, or hopefully increase the number of insects that are out there. But again, one of the curveballs that are thrown at you while you're managing for wildlife. So, we talked a lot of different things today, and trying to just discuss some issues that I've run into and some of the landowners that I work with run into. But just to recap, we don't want to stress out about it. We don't want to look like this poor little bird here. We don't want that to be our image at the end of the day. I encourage you to set those clear and reasonable objectives. That's going to help you reach your objectives and easily measurable. And so at the end of the day, when you're trying to evaluate your management practices, you can determine if you've actually succeeded in reaching those objectives. Let your focal species guide you if you're going to manage according to that one focal species approach, or let the habitat guide you. Let it tell you what you need to do. Maybe you need to get rid of non-native invasives. Maybe you need to promote or plant more, or just allow things to grow and actually mature and flower. Again, each setback is a learning experience, right? I mean, we can learn from our mistakes. We learn just as much from our mistakes as we do our successes. And so learn from it. Don't take it as a defeat at the end of the day. Say, hey, now I can build on what we've done in the mistakes that I've made. And you're not alone in this. Again, we touched on a lot of topics today. You've got the good Dr. Macaulay there as a resource. You've got, your state game agency, your state forest agency there, West Virginia Division of Natural Resources, West Virginia Division of Forestry. I'll even cross state lines. Don't tell Luke, but I'll come over and talk to you if we can. There's a lot of great resources that are out there to help you. And part of what Luke and I do is connect you with those resources. And so definitely reach out if we can help you and put you in contact with the appropriate people. We can do that. And so don't stress out about it. Think, oh my gosh, I'm disease, drought, garden spiders that are eating my butterflies. There's resources available for you. So Luke, I think we've hit that hour-ish mark. And so any questions or comments? Did we miss anything in the chat?
Yeah, we got a few questions coming in on the chat. And thank you. That was great. I really appreciate you sharing all that. Janine asked a little bit back about beavers, and I think she was interested in knowing, can you just say, how would you think about beavers as an objective?
Okay.
What you expect to see in terms of other wildlife also coming in as a result of beavers? How would you try to manage for beavers?
And for that, we're just allowing them to do what they normally would do, right? Our beavers are semi-aquatic rodent here, largest rodent here in North America, and they will dam up areas, build these dams to flood areas to get access to more food. And so, historically speaking, I'll speak here in West Virginia. We had our native beaver populations as we started to colonize the U.S. We kind of wiped out beaver in the eastern U.S. and our last one, like native population, was like 1825. We didn't see another beaver again until 1925. And then there were some actual reintroduction programs to move beaver around and reintroduce them into areas. And so because of this damming behavior, because of their flooding areas, they can be considered a nuisance. And so when I worked in the Southeast and growing up in the Southeast, if beaver are building dams up against a road, we can have a washout of that road, of that bridge. They can flood timber, flood crops. And so they are a great ecological modifier. Building that dam, flooding these areas, they're creating wetlands. And so it can be very beneficial in the right circumstance. They can also be a nuisance in others. And so it's not something that we can move beaver around. You can't go somewhere and buy a beaver and release it on your property. But if you have them start to move in, just let them do what they're doing. If it's safe to do so, if there's no conflicts with roads or flooding or things like that. And so just allowing them to do that and to flood those areas, they're creating that wetland, which is a unique ecosystem that will benefit a multitude of wildlife species. And so, looking at the numbers, there's probably 30, 40 different wildlife species that are associated with those beaver ponds. And so it can be very beneficial. For extra homework, go out and look at what they're doing in the desert Southwest now with moving and relocating beavers and how they're, wilding some of those streams, flooding up some of those streams, and creating these oases, right, of these wetland areas out there. And so it's significant or amazing species and what they can do in terms of just that damming behavior.
Yeah, they are neat. I will say they also, in terms of the damage thing, I think that bothers a lot of people as well, is when they start to chew on really nice mature trees that you might have an attachment to that's near, if it's within 100 feet or 200 feet of a stream, you see them start to do enough damage, they can kill large. I have a beautiful tulip poplar, and it just kind of stinks to see this whole section of it that's eaten out, and eventually it's probably going to cause mortality to that tree. So that's another thing that can bother people. And you can protect individual trees if you have an attachment. You can put wire cages around them and keep those beavers from chewing on them. We had a couple other questions come in. Thank you, Janine, for that one, and thanks, Sheldon, for that good description. Woody Shields asked, the West Virginia deer harvest was less than 25,000 in the 50s and 60s, and now it's much larger on the same land area. Where did all the deer come from? How do we have more deer now? It sounds like we got a higher harvest rate, but we also have higher densities.
Yeah, that's a great question. If you look back, the history of West Virginia, we had a lot of land use changes. Late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a lot of land clearing, land change here in the state of West Virginia, and then some unregulated harvest. And so a lot of deer removed, a lot of land use changes, so impact to the habitat that were here. We almost wiped out deer here in West Virginia. And so you're talking 1920s, 1930s, we were down to about 1,000 deer in the state of West Virginia. So significant decline. Because that habitat responded, naturally it started to regrow because of harvest regulations that were put into place. We have rebuilt our population to what it is today. And don't quote me on this. I don't have the numbers behind it. Let's say 1,000 back in 1930. We're probably up to 350 to 400,000 deer in the state of West Virginia today. That's just off the cuff, numbers throwing out there. And so, yeah, because of land use changes, because of this habitat regrowing, because of restrictions in harvest, we've rebuilt this population to, if I ask you today, how many deer in your state, a common response will be too many. If you're a hunter that haven't had any success yet, too few. Kind of depends on which side of the fence you're sitting on there. But it's been a great success story. And so through habitat management, harvest restrictions, and we actually moved deer around from those high mountain counties here in West Virginia to other parts of the state. And then we brought in deer from other states to repopulate our deer herd. And now you see, if you're thinking, I can remember hearing stories landowners will say, or citizens here in West Virginia will say they would let out school when they saw a deer track. And so I said, we've got to go see this track to, just to see that yes, there are deer on the landscape. And we still have some hunters who are, in that rebuilding the population kind of mentality, the traditional style of hunting, who will only harvest bucks and not harvest does. And so we've got some gender issues in terms of too many does and too few bucks because of harvest pressure. And so there are a lot of things going on with our deer population. But yeah, it's regrown. In many cases, we're overpopulated, too many deer. We need to change our deer harvest strategies. And I would love to see, so if you're not a hunter, please consider being one. If you are a hunter, take more, please, kind of deal. We've got a lot of mouths out there on the landscape that are feeding on what we're trying to grow.
Awesome, Sheldon. We got two more came in. Real quick, Brendan, who's been a longtime participant in our programs, she asked you to differentiate and explain some of the difference between EHD, which is ectohemorrhagic disease, I think is, if I'm getting that right, and CWD.
Okay. So yeah, so we use acronyms, right? So we've got CWD, which is chronic wasting disease, and then we have EHD, which is epizootic hemorrhagic disease. We'll start with CWD. Chronic wasting disease is caused by a prion, which is a malformed protein. If you can imagine a square protein, it folds over on itself, and then it goes to other proteins and says, hey, look how cool I am, fold this way. And it creates these kind of spongy areas within the central nervous system. And so it's this prion, this protein is a non-living organism. And so it's very stable within the environment. It's very persistent within the environment. We have it, you have it there in Maryland, and we have it there in the eastern panhandle of West Virginia. We have it only in about 6 counties there in our eastern panhandle area. That's kind of slowly spreading because it's so persistent in the environment. But it's CWD is caused by that prion or prion, however you want to pronounce it. Whereas EHD, epizootic hemorrhagic disease, is a virus. And so it is one of the, here the hemorrhagic diseases, you have blue tongue, and then you have EHD, genetically distinct, but very similar in terms of viruses. Blue tongue is commonly found in livestock. EHD is commonly found in our cervid populations and whitetail deer. They can cross over. We can have blue tongue in deer and EHD in cattle as well. But because it's that virus, we kind of have these kind of pop-up outbreaks periodically. So every 3 to 5 years, we may have an outbreak. This is a pretty significant one that we're having this year with 18 different counties. It's not that, it's not covering the entire county, but little outbreaks in each of those counties. That virus is spread by a biting midge, the Culicoides species. And so in drought areas or late summer, when our water resources kind of recede, we have these mud flats where the biting midges will reproduce. And so you have more biting midges, the presence of the virus and the presence of deer, you can have these EHD outbreaks. Again, it's not zoonotic, and also CWD hasn't been shown to cross that species barrier yet. So neither of these are zoonotic, but definitely some different concerns, and they're just different modes of action and different spread across the state. So they are different, but I know we always throw the CWD and EHD, the acronyms kind of are confusing that way. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, I think she's familiar. I think she must want to make sure everybody else is not
Okay.
confusing those two important things as well, because I know Brenda's a big hunter and I'm sure
Yeah.
she's pretty knowledgeable about this stuff. We great question from Ed, and this is something I talk a lot about. I post a lot about on social media. But he asked, we have some fields in our property we used to mow for the last 3 years. We've let them grow throughout the warm season. Is there a good time or a best time to mow the fields after the growing season? Late fall, late winter? I want to provide cover, but we never mow when the field will start growing trees.
Yeah.
But if we never mow, then the field will start growing trees, which we don't want in these field areas. So how would you recommend managing that grassland?
Yeah, and again, I go back to that kind of let the vegetation tell you what you need to do. And even in mowing, it doesn't necessarily always get rid of that woody encroachment or setback succession. Some species it will, but others you just kind of cut the top off of it, so you have a shorter, black locust out there instead of a tall black locust. And so you may need to try some other techniques in terms of chemical control or mechanical removal of some of those woody species that are growing out there. I like the idea of cover through the winter. And so I recommend to a lot of our landowners, if you're going to mow it, brush hog or bush hog that type of vegetation, wait till late winter, right before spring. And so you can kind of get the cover off of the plants growing in underneath, but you're providing some winter cover in the seed heads that are out there all through the winter for a lot of species. So late winter is a great time to kind of set that back if you're going to mow it. And you may consider strip mowing portions of it or patch mowing portions of it. There's a lot of different practices you can put into place to kind of create this mosaic of vegetation and cover in your backyard.
Yeah, yeah, I think that sort of diversity and also, yeah, by doing the strip mowing or part of the field at a time and allowing some recovery so you can kind of
Mhm.
leave some cover while the other part starts to regenerate. Yeah, we recommend in Maryland, February, March, because it's already warming up, so they don't need that cover as much. And as soon as that is mowed off, we start getting a lot of new fresh growth. So,
Yeah.
but I think combining that with, to even be better with rotationally getting that mowing done over the course of a few weeks would also help leave a little bit of cover while these other areas start to recover. So,
Yeah.
great question, Ed, and awesome to hear that you're keeping some fields in that early successional habitat. I posted a link to our bobwhite quail habitat guide where we go over the four main types of disturbance that are preferred for bobwhites. And mowing is not one of them because it tends to create a thatch on the ground. So one of these things that we always hear about from a lot of our services is to not have bare ground. Quail are one of these species that like bare ground. And so we use disking, herbicides, you could use grazing, and fourth is prescribed fire as types of disturbances that can help set back some of that vegetation to varying extents. I think sometimes fire at the wrong time might not manage those woody trees as well. You can use it a little bit more in the fall to impact them a little bit more, but it might not kill them entirely. So that's where you get those herbicide or maybe some heavier levels of disking to set back woody vegetation. I'm curious, Sheldon, have you used disking to set back some of those woody stems? Have you had success doing that? Do you know anybody who's doing that?
Well, here in the mountain state, we have one or two rocks that we have to deal with.
Oh,
And so disking is not a common practice to do that,
right.
just because of the issues with slope and the number of rocks that are out there. And so
Yeah.
we do a lot more with chemical in terms of now Eastern Panhandle, we do a little bit of the disking, incorporating just that above ground biomass, 50% ish of that above ground biomass can kind of set back succession in some of those areas, but it's not a common practice across the state just because of topography and some of the limitations there.
Yeah, yeah. And the disking will sometimes set back some of these shrubs, but sometimes they'll survive. So you might need to do a heavier disking or multiple passes, and they still might, it'll
Yeah,
set them back a bit, maybe a year or two or three, but they
yeah.
might still pop back. So,
In those cool season dominating, if we've got fescue fields and things, you've really got to get rid of that cool season carpet because we've tried a few strip plots and within 1 year it's just back to pure fescue. And
mhm.
so sometimes again, take all these with a grain of salt. There's a lot of different activities. Let the vegetation tell you what you need to do and see the response. Well, that didn't work. We need to try something else. Um,
Yeah. I actually just posted about this topic a bit yesterday, that fescue issue, and I'm going to post it into the chat for anybody who might want to look at it. But yeah, there are yeah, cool season fescue grass just generally doesn't provide a lot of great habitat for our wildlife, especially when it's mowed. and kept
Yeah.
short. So you don't end up with a lot of cover, and a lot of natives, even if it is grown up, it's too thick and too sod forming for a lot of our species to use. So holds the soil in place well, and I think that's why it's a commonly used thing
Yeah.
is for water quality issues. But
Yeah.
I think
And
we
for
get
livestock, if you're,
yeah,
so it's a
for
great
grazing.
forage, for livestock as well. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, great, Sheldon. We got some thank yous coming through. Oh, Dorothy asked, "What's disking?" Disking is ooh, sometimes the most these things I take for granted that people know. Sheldon, do you want to describe disking? You're so articulate on these. I would have a hard time saying how I
well,
would.
well, you know, another common term that we'll use is plowing. And so what you're doing is using a disc, or it's kind of like, it looks like a disc or like a plate, a curved plate, to actually break up that sod or break up the ground. So when we're disking, we pull this behind a tractor, set it down into the ground, and it will break up or disturb that upper topsoil, upper layer, 2 to 3 inches down into the ground. And so that's disking or plowing. It's just, the disc itself is kind of looks like a plate, if you will, and it's kind of slicing through the soil, versus a plow kind of looks like an angled arrowhead or something. It's kind of cutting through and kind of just laying the ground over on itself. So it's just a way for us to kind of disturb that few upper inches of topsoil.
Yeah, and to get into the details, Dorothy, I just put a little picture on the chat. But yeah, it's a farming implement with yeah, that disturbs the soil. I guess I'm curious. Usually we think about plowing as probably deeper level disturbance, or sometimes several inches under the soil. Disking tends to be a relatively top, maybe 1 to 3 inches of the soil
Yeah.
that would be disturbed, rather than a deeper 4 or 5 and deeper
Yeah.
inches from
Yeah.
plowing. Great. Thank you, Dorothy. Glad we cleared that up. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Look forward to seeing you guys next week for next month for Dan Small's presentation, and hope you guys have a great rest of your afternoon.